Okay, good afternoon. I've asked you to print out chapter 1, 2 and 3, ठीक है ना, because we are using the first, as I said before, is just the definitions, right, just the terminology. The second is just a summary of some equations that can be used, right, उसमें परेशान होने की बात नहीं है, you don't need to know everything, right, and then because we are going to do selected topics, right, and the third is about the properties of the nucleus, ठीक है, so we are studying the properties of the nucleus, right, and because nuclear physics is mostly based on the properties of the nucleus. So, we are not going to talk about the surrounding electrons, so we are not going to talk about the atom as a whole, we are only going to talk about the center of the atom, which is the nucleus. Now, the nucleus is very interesting, right. It has a number of very mysterious properties, and this is what makes it very useful, as well as it is also sometimes more complex to study. Okay. So, for example, what are the properties we can have? You can have properties like electric charge. So, we are talking about nuclear chapter 3, nuclear properties. By nuclear we mean the nucleus. Okay. So, electric charge, radius, we have mass, we have binding energy like we have discussed in the previous classes, angular momentum, parity, magnetic dipole, plus electric, quadrupole, moments, and energies of excited states. Okay. So, these are some of the properties that we will be discussing. These are static properties of the nucleus. Okay. So, these are static properties. In this chapter we are only going to talk about the static properties, and then in later chapters we will also discuss the dynamical properties. Okay. So, for example, in later chapters we will be talking about decays and reactions and other such phenomena. In this chapter we are just looking at the nucleus itself. Okay. So, let us start with the first one, which is the nuclear radius. So, we know that just as an atom has a radius, the nucleus also has a radius, but again this is not a very well defined quantity. So, it is again we need to use several indirect methods to try to understand the size of the nucleus. So, for example, we can use the Coulomb potential. Okay. This is the potential that binds the atom and the resulting electronic charge distribution, and similarly we know that according to the previous class we know that the nucleons themselves are held together by a binding energy. ठीक है ना? Previously when you must have studied binding energy for the first time, you were talking about the binding energy of the electrons to the atom, but now in this course we have talked about the binding energy of the nucleons within the nucleus, right. Okay. We know that at a distance range of, let us say, 10 raised to minus 10 meters, this quantity decreases, right, it becomes negligible. So, we do not have a well defined boundary, rather we have a sort of a field and a probability, it is based on these concepts. So, for nuclei, density of nucleons and nuclear potential have a spatial dependence. You understand the word spatial, right? So, it depends upon the density of nucleons, like we talked in the previous class. Different elements will have different number of nucleons inside the nucleus. So, the radius will also depend on that, and it will also depend on the nuclear potential. So, it will be relatively constant over small distances, beyond which they will drop rapidly to 0. Therefore, there are two terms that we will use to define the nuclear shape. Or defined or characterized. So, you have the mean radius and you have the skin thickness. Okay, so these are the two parameters that we will be using. Let us define these parameters, the mean radius. So, did you upload the photos you took last time? किए थे, भेजे थे ग्रुप पे? अच्छा, नंबर किए? नंबर भी कर दिया करो उसका ऑर्डर, क्योंकि डाउनलोड करके ये ना आगे पीछे हो जाए, राइट? ओके, सो आई एम गोइंग टू ले लो आप फोटो अभी. Okay. So, the mean radius where the density is half its central value. Okay, and the skin thickness it is defined the length over which the density drops from near its maximum to near its minimum. So, what are we talking about? We are talking about the density of the nucleons, the region where the density has its central value, it is known as the mean radius, and then the region where you get a maximum value and then you get a drop. So, we measure this, and this is defined as the skin thickness. I will also show you this in the book. Does anyone have a printout? No. Okay, I will just open it and see it now in a short while. So, the radius that we measure depends on the kind of experiment that we are doing to measure its nuclear shape. Of course, different kinds of experiments over time have been designed in order to try to understand these parameters, right. So, we will discuss this a little bit